So last time we looked at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the rescue of Lot out of it. And remember that God rescued Lot for Abraham's sake. Right? When we looked at it, we saw that Lot's behavior was not exactly pristine, offering up his virgin daughters to these guys. Anyway, God rescued Lot, but it was because of Abraham. And we're going to find out tonight that afterwards the whole family kind of acted despicably, at least from the standpoint of the modern mind, or from the mindset that we have today. Starting in verse 30 of Genesis 19, it says, "Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, 'Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father.'" You could see that possibly after witnessing what happened, they might have thought the whole world had been destroyed. Who knows? Or at least all of humanity. To our mind, or to our modern mindset, the whole idea was repulsive, right? But if we consider this carefully,
she's putting her motive right there at the end, so we can preserve offspring.
Mm-hmm. So they may have thought that was the only option, is what I'm thinking. But, this isn't the first time such stuff has happened. If you look at Genesis 4:17, we kind of gloss over this statement, but it says Cain knew his wife. Well, his wife had to be his sister, right? There were no other options. And then in Genesis 9 and 10, after the flood, we're very familiar with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? But we're not told that any of Noah's daughters survived, right? So consider the next, the Shem, Ham, and Japheth already had wives, right? So the next generation, Noah's granddaughters, right? Or grandsons, we know their names, don't know their sons' wives' names, but those wives had to have been, at the very, very, very furthest, their first cousins, right?
Yeah, again, that's the same situation as you were saying earlier. From our day of now, our judgment about it compared to their judgment, there was nobody else.
Yep.
And
not a lot of options.
They weren't even thinking of that aspect of it.
Yep. Now, of course, if you go ahead and read Leviticus, God put in some very strict restrictions on sexual relations in families, but this was before that, and
this is before the separation of the peoples at Babel.
Mm-hmm. So, not Lot and his daughters, but Cain and the grandsons of Noah, certainly. However, having said all that, it would seem that none of them were very comfortable with this idea. Otherwise, why did the daughter? Well, let's make our father drink wine. Why did she think that she needed to do that? Anyway, in verse 33, it says, "So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose." Now, I need to reiterate, I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, right? I still do. Not going to back off on that. God said it, I believe it. However, I'm having a real hard time believing this story. I really am. First of all, how did the daughter make him drink wine? Surely, she didn't, hold his nose and pour it down his throat. This sort of sounds like the old Flip Wilson, the devil made me do it excuse, And furthermore, why did she feel that she had to get her father drunk in order to be, if she was so justified about, making offspring for her father, right? And then finally, the big question to me is if Noah or Lot was so drunk that he didn't even know when she came in and when she left, how could he have impregnated her? It seems sort of hard to buy to me. And then in verse 34 it says, the next day the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let's make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. Well, okay, if you'll accept the first story, I guess you'll accept the second one. But something occurred to me. Either these girls were in pretty close sync in their cycles, or this happened multiple times. They had to have been I can't even remember my basic biology. Had to have been within like 3 days of each other.
Which happens.
Yeah.
Women all live in the same house is not unusual at all. Go into estrus all at the same time. Imagine
Feel for the father.
Yeah, well, Pat had Jean Marie, and Jana, and they were all within start to finish less than 2 weeks, and they all had big time
PMS.
So yeah, it's a half a month.
Sounds like time to go on a road trip with the boys. So verse 37, the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, which means of his father. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami, which means son of my people. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Now, the Ammonites and the Moabites were like everybody in the region, except for, the Hebrews, idolaters. They worshipped, these non-gods.
And the Hebrews were too, a lot.
Yeah, we'll get to that when we talk about Moab. But the Ammonites in particular worshiped this god called Molech. And by the way, if you read up on this, you'll find out that modern, I don't know what you'd call them, archaeologists or anthropologists, or anyway, they say that Molech wasn't really a god, that it was a type of sacrifice. And to me, what it is just another symptom of the Bible not getting a level playing field with other writings. Mm-hmm. My favorite example, how many contemporary manuscripts of Caesar's Chronicles of the Gallic Wars are in existence today? Anybody know? It's a natural number. Sorry, it's a whole number, but it's not a natural number. It is neither positive nor negative.
Yeah.
Zero.
There are no contemporary manuscripts of Caesar's Chronicles of the Gallic War. But nobody doubts that Caesar wrote them. Mm-hmm. Right? The Bible doesn't get a level playing field. Anyway, so there are multiple instances in the Bible where it talks about this god Molech. And you can find there, I've listed them there. But and I guess for the benefit of, well, anyway, I've listed a bunch of those there. And it talks about passing the children through the fire. What the worship of this god Molech was they had this stone image of the god with his arms outstretched, and they would build a fire under the arms, and then they would throw live infants onto the arms and burn them alive. The Moabite god Chemosh was a god of warfare, and he also required human sacrifice. So both the Moabites and the Ammonites were into human sacrifice, and the Ammonites in particular into child sacrifice.
It just occurred to me that what Lot's daughters did was the same thing what Sarah and Abraham did, not trusting God, trying to take matters into their own hands, and the result
Well, it's a
was
horrible, couple of horrible
generations
nationalities.
of
Suffering.
from other,
Well,
nations.
yes, but we have to give them a little bit of a break. They may have thought that there was no more humanity after they witnessed what happened at Sodom.
Well, Zoar
Well,
wasn't
Zoar
destroyed.
wasn't hit.
Yeah. He
Zoar was
didn't
left
go to
intact.
Zoar wasn't
That's
destroyed.
true. That's true. So presumably there were people living there,
Yeah.
but Lot wasn't living in Zoar. He was living up in the mountains in a cave, right? They didn't want to go back there.
What
Who
was
knows?
he afraid of? He said he was afraid to go to Zoar. What was he afraid of?
Who knows? Maybe the same thing that was going on in Sodom, where they wanted those guys to come out to that we may know them, right? Yep. Anyway, because of these, this horrendous, heinous idolatry, it's kind of difficult to understand what God's purposes were in allowing these two children to be born. We just have to trust that His will is perfect and that He knows more than we know.
Well, he doesn't stop the progress of sin.
No, He doesn't.
But he works through it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because, like, Ruth was a Moabitess, right?
Yeah, we'll
That's
get to
the line
that
of
too.
Jesus,
Yep.
you know? That's how Jesus came.
Mm-hmm. Well, you guys are jumping ahead again.
Well, it's just a paragraph.
So this idolatry was so bad, and because later on, when the Israelites were coming back from their wilderness wandering, the Ammonites would not let them pass, the Moabites would not let them pass. God gave this prohibition that Moses reiterated in Deuteronomy 23. He says, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you." And so it's intriguing that Ruth, who was a Moabite woman, certainly she and Boaz were members of their local assembly. So God allowed that. Maybe He made a differentiation between Moabite men and Moabite women. Who knows?
Well, it's also possible that she basically converted to be an Israelite.
Well, she was married to Naomi's sons, right? Well, one of them.
And a lot of the prohibitions in Scripture about marrying wives is that the wives would continue their worship
Right.
of the other gods, whereas Ruth
Did not.
accepted.
What is it? Wherever you go, I go, and I will go, and your people will be my people, is what she said,
Your
right?
God, my God.
So let's look at the cities of the valley map, if I can find my mouse. Oh, we're already on it. Okay, so we've seen this map before. The Moabites, let's start with the Ammonites. The Ammonites lived in this area up east of the mountains, east of Jericho. And the Moabites lived down here along the eastern side of the Dead Sea, this area here. Down, it doesn't show it here, but further south here is the area where Esau later settled. Edom and Seir is called. And by the way, I wanted to say something here about this. This says the Valley of Sodom, right? But if you look at this very carefully, somebody has put this little label over the top here. See that?
Uh-huh.
Now look at the other maps. See how this area is the...
Mm-hmm.
Remember we talked about this.
Yeah.
Sometimes this is a peninsula and sometimes it's solid. If you look at this other map here, you can't, it's kind of hard to see underneath this label right here. But notice that that's a land bridge all the way across in this time. Now, I haven't double checked him on this, but he's pretty good. This may be the way it looked at that time. Remember we said that the level of the Dead Sea rises and falls with the population. So at this time it must have been fairly low, and the southern pool was, almost drying up. Whereas in this time it was fairly high. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out because this is just a label that somebody put on top of there. So there was actually water even in that time. So the Moabites lived down in this area here on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. And initially they had this whole area from, I forget what the name of this little river is here. They had this whole area from all the way up to the top of the Dead Sea to the inflow of the Jordan. But later on, the Amorites, this King Sihon from the Amorites, who came from up here in this area. Anybody know what? Well, actually, it's a little bit further south from there. This is just, it's not working very well. Okay. He came from up here and conquered the Moabite territory down to the Arnon River. And when the Israelites came back from their wilderness wandering, they came up this way and they asked for passage through Moab. Didn't get it, so they went around by the King's Highway here and came up to Jericho this way. And they had to fight this guy Sihon, or Sihon, however you'd pronounce that, the king of the Amorites. And also and it's not shown on this map, I don't think, they fought the people of Bashan under their king Og and defeated him. Bashan, by the way, anybody know what Bashan is called today? Don't look at the map or don't look at the notes. It's called the Golan Heights. That's further north up on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, God forbid the Israelites, when they came back from messing with Ammon in Deuteronomy 2:19, Moses is reiterating what God had told him. He says, "And when you approach the territory of the people of Ammon, do not harass them or contend with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession." Now, throughout the time of the judges and the kings, Moab and Ammon both fought against Israel. David eventually subdued the both of them and was exacting tribute from them. You can read about that in 2 Samuel 10. And as a matter of fact, it was during one of the wars with the Ammonites when they were besieging the city of Rabbah. And I meant to... Let's see, where's that? Where's it? Yeah, I'm trying to find the best map for that. Right here.
Right under the word Ammon.
This right here, it's kind of hard to see. This right here is the river Jabbok. It's one of the tributaries to the Jordan. It flows into the Jordan right here. And it goes through this very deep gorge, or down from this very deep gorge, from the desert area on the east side of the mountains. Rabbah right now, the ruins of Rabbah are very near Amman, the capital of Jordan, which is right about here. So Rabbah was the capital of the Ammonites at the time, and it's very near the current capital of the Ammonites, the Jordanians. Anyway, it was during the siege of that city Rabbah that David told the commander of his army, Joab, put Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband, right in the middle of the battle, and when the battle gets really heated, withdraw from him. That happened during the siege of that capital city of Ammon. You can read about that in 2 Samuel 7. So, in the latter part of his life, you remember Solomon had 700 wives and 300 porcupines, right? Well, in the latter part of his life, Solomon not only allowed his wives to continue worshiping their foreign gods, he established places for them to do that, including a place where Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites that we talked about with the child sacrifices, he set up high places where those could be worshipped in Israel by Israelites. That's what Randy was saying earlier. They fell into idolatry. They've done it over and over and over again. Later on, and you can read about that, by the way, in 1 Kings 11, where Solomon set up those high places. Later on, King Josiah destroyed those high places and a bunch more. But the Israelites continued to engage in idolatry off and on. The book of Judges is full of that stuff. And then when King Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged Jerusalem, he used proxies from Moab and Ammon as part of his forces. You can read about that in 2 Kings 24. And then finally, when Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, after they had the Israelites had returned from the Babylonian captivity. In the meantime, Babylon itself had been overthrown by the Persians, and King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah was working for him, right, as a cupbearer, and so he got letters from the king to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Remember that? It's in the book of Nehemiah. One of the people that resisted the rebuilding of those walls was Tobiah, an Ammonite, right? Anyway, so let's see. We've looked at those other two maps. Looked at the area where the Moabites settled. It's not on any of these maps. It might be on this wilderness wandering map.
Yeah, they find fossils of Ammonites around all the time.
Boom. He's got a million of them. When Israel returned from Egypt, remember they passed through Edom? Edom is where Esau ended up, Jacob's twin brother. Hopefully we'll get there. And also Seir was a part of Edom's territory. Is it in here? Is Basra? Yeah, Basra, right here. Anybody know what Basra is called today? Hint, has anybody seen my screensaver? No, you haven't seen my lock screen. It's called Petra. That's where the famous sandstone formations are. Anyway, it's in Basra, and it's the wind has carved all kinds of patterns into this sandstone. Positively amazing. Anyway, we already talked about the Amorites having taken part of the Moabite territory down here to the river Arnon. And God had directed Moses not to mess with the Moabites either. In Deuteronomy 2, starting in verse 8, it says, "So we went on away from our brothers, the people of Esau," right? Esau is Edom. Edom is another name for Esau, who live in Seir, away from the Arabah road, from Eloth to Ezion-Geber, and we turned and went in the direction of the wilderness of Moab. So it's right here that he's talking about that turn that they made. Where are we at? In the direction of Moab. And the Lord said to me, "Do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar," and that's another name of this area south of the Arnon River, to Lot, to the people of Lot for a possession. So they skirted around the Moabite territory, going here on the King's Highway, and then came back into Jericho that way. And of course, they had to go to battle against this guy Sihon first here at what's the name of that place? Jahaz. And there's
Sihon was not considered Ammonite.
He was an Amorite. He came down.
Okay.
He came down and conquered part of Moab. The original Amorite territory was up in here, and then he conquered about half of Moab. And then the Israelites, when they came back, had a bad. I mean, they asked the Lord, and He said, "Go up against them, because I've given them into your hand." And they defeated him here at Jahaz. By the way, this is a typo again, right? Remember that typo? That should be Numbers 21 to 33. You've seen that before. If you were paying attention, really close attention. So let's see. And you can read about those battles where they defeated Sihon and Og, the king of Bashan, in Deuteronomy 2 and Numbers 21. It's listed here on this map. Afterwards, they camped at this place called Shittim, and I don't think that's shown here. Where is it? Yeah, okay. East of Jericho, right? And they went into Jericho this way. By the way, when you go to Jordan today, if you go on the trip that goes down to Petra, you'll go across the bridge right here. It's the only place where the border between Israel and Jordan is open. Matter of fact, John the Baptist was baptizing somewhere around here. Nobody really knows where, but there's a place there that they say, right, is where that was, and there's an IDF soldier there with her Uzi and her, combat uniform, and on the other side of the river, and I'm telling you, the other side of the river is not as far as from me to that door, that bedroom door. On the other side of the river, there's a Jordanian in full ceremonial uniform, wool coat, muzzle-loading long rifle, and the big sash and everything, and the big headdress. And they just stand there across from each other all day long, 24/7. Right? And there's a little piece of PVC in the middle of the river, and that's the border.
How much you want to bet the minute everybody's back is turned, they get together for a game of go fish or something.
Who knows? Yeah. So when they got here, they're up here at where did we say that was?
Right above
Shittim, right here. When they got here, the Moabites were afraid they were going to turn south and attack Moab. So Balak, the king of Moab, hired this guy Balaam to curse them. right? And he was somewhere in Mesopotamia, right? Who knows exactly where? There, I saw a bunch of potential places where he may have come from. This place, what is it called? Peor. Nobody really knows where that was either. And of course, he couldn't curse them, and his donkey talked to him, and all that stuff. You can read about all that in Numbers 22 to 24. Nevertheless, while they were camped at Shittim, some of the Israelite men began to consort. That's a very good word. I said fornicate. But consort is a much better word. I may have to change that. With the Moabite women, right there in the plains of Moab, and they began to worship this their god Baal of Peor, and so because of that, really because of the idolatry more than the adultery. Although I think Paul said that neither idolaters nor adulterers, anyway, God brought a plague on them, and it killed 24,000 before eventually all of the people that had been worshiping Baal of Peor were purged out of the nation. You can read about that in Numbers 25.
From what I've studied, because if you look at the story of Balaam,
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't really seem to do anything wrong. He listens to God. He refuses to go with the people until God says, "No, you go ahead and go." And then he won't say anything except what God tells him to say.
He couldn't because God,
From
compelled
what
him.
I've studied or read is they said that this thing of the women seducing the men of Israel was at Balaam's suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
That was the way to
Yeah, I've heard that
for
preached
them
too.
to cause Israel to be cursed.
Well, I can't curse him, but I'll
But
tell
there's
you what.
nothing really in the Bible that says that.
Right. I looked, by the way.
But afterwards, Balaam is considered to be, a really bad guy. But
Yep.
as far as the scriptural story, he seems to
Seems to have done what God
done exactly
told him
what
to do.
God told him to do. So
Yep. When we read a little bit later about Abimelech, he did the same thing. He wasn't an Israelite, but anyway, let's see here.
well, Abraham wasn't an Israelite either.
He's a Hebrew. Israel wasn't around yet. So Moses died. If you remember, it talks about God taking him up to Mount Nebo. I'm not sure which of these maps is the best of that. Probably this one. Mount Nebo is right there. I can't remember how tall it is. It's pretty tall. And he showed him, remember, he was able to see from here, he was able to see the Great Sea, which is off of this map to the west, and he was able to see the entire Jordan Valley from the Galilee up here to, it said he was able to see as far as Zoar. Although remember, even though there's no question mark here, we don't know where Zoar was. But anyway, God took him up onto Mount Nebo, and I think that's the peak of Mount Nebo right there, but it's right in here somewhere. And then God buried him somewhere in the valley of Moab, right? So down in here, and nobody knows where, except for who were those two guys that Jude talks about, contending over the body of Moses.
It comes from one of the apocryphal books.
Yep.
I don't remember the names.
I can't remember their names either. Anyway, so Moses is buried somewhere in Moabite territory, or the original Moabite territory, before the king of the Amorites conquered it down to the Arnon down here. There's a bunch of war between the Israelites and the Moabites during the time of the Judges and the Kings. David eventually subdued them and exacted tribute from them. As we said, Solomon established the worship of Chemosh, the Moabite god. And then during the Babylonian exile, some of the Israelites who had been left behind married Moabites. And when Nehemiah got back, he purged them from the assembly of the Lord, because remember, God had said you won't have a Moabite or an Ammonite in the assembly, right? By the way, during Nehemiah, probably the most famous thing about the book of Nehemiah is they found the book of the Lord, the book of the law, which they hadn't been following for hundreds of years. And who was it that ripped his garment, and they started following? They had the first Passover again after they returned, and started following it, kind of, sort of. Anyway, so moving on into the next chapter here.
By the way, it was Archangel Michael and the devil that contended
over the body of Moses. Wasn't the other two? What was that thing in Jude that was talking about those other two guys? Anyway, they were Egyptian magicians. Anyway, who knows? So remember when we studied Genesis 12, Abram and Sarai went down to Egypt briefly to get away from this famine that was up in the land, and they lied to Pharaoh, saying that Sarai was Abraham's sister rather than his wife, right? Well, and you remember, God used Pharaoh to school them. Well, apparently they didn't take the lesson, because here they are doing it again. Verse 1 of chapter 20. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of Negev, which means south country, and lived between Kadesh, which means holy, and Shur, which means wall. And he sojourned in Gerar, which means a lodging place. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister," and Abimelech, which means my father is king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, let's look at this Patriots in Canaan map, or Patriarchs in Canaan. I don't think George Washington was there. Anyway, Shur is off the map here. Nobody knows exactly where it was, but it's in northeastern Europe, or Egypt somewhere. Not northeastern Europe, definitely northeastern Egypt. And Kadesh, its location is known. So Abraham came from up here under the oaks of Mamre, remember, up here where he witnessed the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he moved his tent down to Kadesh here. But for some reason, he had to sometimes sojourn in Gerar. Nobody knows exactly where Gerar was either, but it was southeast of Gaza. This area right here is Gaza. So anyway, let's see where we are. Why Abraham went there, we don't know. He remember that in that time, many of the people, probably most of the people in Southwest Asia, were nomadic herdsmen. Some of them still are. One of my favorite stories is the king of Saudi Arabia in the 1980s, I guess it was, or the 1990s, built this huge apartment complex called Khobar Towers. You may have heard of Khobar Towers, because there was a big bombing there that killed a bunch of Americans. Anyway, he built this Khobar Towers, and it was probably close to a mile on a side, full of these 8, 10-story apartment buildings. He built them for the, what do you call those Arabic? Bedouins. For the Bedouins to live in. Well, they didn't want to live in them. They wanted to live in tents
Yeah.
with their animals, right? And so all of Khobar Towers, almost all of Khobar Towers, is completely empty, right? Because they prefer a nomadic lifestyle.
They used to.
Just, yep. But, for some reason, Abraham had to go to Gerar now and again. Maybe he had some kind of trading relationship with them. Who knows? Now, this name Abimelech, it's a name, but it's also a title. It's kind of like Pharaoh. If you read in the Word, it talks about Pharaoh did this and Pharaoh did that. It doesn't say the Pharaoh did that, but that's what it really means, right? There were different pharaohs. Remember when they first went down, or when Joseph first got sold into slavery down there was one Pharaoh there, right? And he eventually ended up as second in command to that Pharaoh. And then later on, after a few generations later, there was another Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph and didn't know about Joseph. And anyway, Pharaoh is a name and a title, right? Abimelech is a name and a title. So Abraham and Sarah, apparently, as I said, didn't learn their lesson about lying to Pharaoh, and they decided to lie to Abimelech as well. That reminded me of the proverb that in Proverbs 26:11, like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. But God didn't give them what they deserved, right? Which is just amazing, right? The way He treats us, even when we're being not good. Remember, God had credited Abraham's faith as righteousness, right? And He does the same for us. He those that He has clothed in His righteousness, He lifts up. And that reminded me of another proverb, Proverbs 24:16. For the righteous falls 7 times and rises again, but the wicked stumble in times of calamity. Now, you may be asking yourself why I keep referring to this lie as a sin. Remember, God had not codified into the commandments the command not to bear false witness yet. That happened much later. But God nevertheless punished it, right? Remember when they lied to Pharaoh, God brought plagues upon Pharaoh's household. And that is an indication our sins have consequences that are apart from ourselves. Our sins affect other people.
Just like with Jonah.
Yep, exactly. Abraham and Sarah should have remembered that lesson that God taught them in Egypt, but they didn't. Now, I just as an aside here, remember, biblical narratives are not usually chronological, right? Or often not chronological, I could say. But if this happened right after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, in the order that we read it in, it's kind of funny when we think about it. Because Sarah would have been almost 90 years old, right? Remember, she was 90 when she had Isaac. And, well, don't remember that. Look forward to that next time when she has Isaac, when she's 90. And at the time, she would have been pregnant with Isaac, right? Because remember, God said about this time next year, right? She would have been pregnant with Isaac by the time Sodom and Gomorrah got destroyed, and Abraham made his way down to Kadesh Barnea. So I thought it was kind of funny. Maybe Abimelech took all of the sisters of the people that sojourned in Gerar into his harem. Who knows? Maybe this happened at some other time. And it occurred to me, if she did show up, she's 90 years old, she's pregnant, she would have been showing by this time. People would have been asking, well, where's your husband? Right? I don't know. Just a thought, anyway. In verse 3 of chapter 20, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you're a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you've done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. Is that me?
That was you.
Am I that guy?
You are that guy.
Telling you.
Reminds me. I don't want to be that guy.
Lightning has been detected in my area. So once more, God pulled Abraham and Sarah's turkey bacon out of the fire. It's got to be turkey bacon, right? Because they don't eat pig. Whether or not this episode occurred right after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, remember, God had determined before even he began creation that he was going to bring forth the salvation of all mankind, the Mashiach, Jesus, through Sarah's son Isaac.
By Abraham.
And so the next step in the fulfillment of that eternal plan of salvation couldn't happen if Sarah was in Abimelech's harem, right? So God, and I said that in a sense, God didn't have any choice. He had to pull their turkey bacon out of the fire in order to press forward with his plan of salvation. That, of course, is a human understanding of the nature of God, who is not within the confines of time. But anyway, God is a righteous judge. Remember, David said in Psalm 51, against you only have I sinned, so that you may be found righteous in your judgments. He didn't punish Abimelech. Abimelech didn't deserve to be punished, even though Abimelech was not one of God's so-called chosen people, right? And that, to me, reminded me that we, too, are not part of Israel, right? We're not God's chosen people, but we may partake in the same salvation that they can partake in, like Abimelech, if we repent of our sins. And I thought it was interesting. Abimelech, an idolater, recognized God in this dream. He knew it was God talking to him, right? And so that begged the question to me. We see God appearing to or speaking to people in dreams. Remember Joseph, the angel of the Lord came to him. We don't know who that angel was, right? But he spoke to him in a dream, right? There are all kinds of instances throughout God's Word of people receiving a word from God in a dream, and that begs the question to me that I wanted to ask you. Does God still do this? Does he still speak in dreams?
He always has, he always will.
It's a good answer. Mm-hmm. Since he's unchanging.
He can do whatever he wants.
Do you have any personal experience of it? So I guess my real question.
Not particularly that I would think of.
No.
But I've heard people's testimonies of that.
Yep. It's an intriguing question to me. Does God still speak in dreams? Because, I've had, dreams about God and dreams of being told things. Are they really God, or is that just my overactive imagination?
You shouldn't have quite so much. You went to bed.
Shouldn't
It was
have.
the salami talking.
Yeah. what is it that Scrooge said?
Oh, yeah.
There's more of gravy than of grave about you. To which the ghost became rather upset, if you remember. So in verse 8, it says, So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you that you have brought me and my kingdom a great sin, brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me these things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, What did you see that you did these things? Did this thing? Abraham and Sarah were blinded to the potential harm that they could cause through this lie. It's just a little white lie, right? And, our sin blinds us to the effects that it has on others. But Abimelech, the idolater, clearly understood it. I find that very intriguing.
I think it's evidence that there were cultural taboos against adultery that existed before God codified it in the law.
Yep.
Because there is an innate sense of sin and so forth, even without the law.
Yep. And even though Abraham and Sarah were willing to do it, Abimelech called it sin right to Abraham's face.
God said, "That's another man's wife."
Yep.
That's well, I didn't know that.
And even the idolaters understood that adultery is not
Well,
right.
even today in those Judeo-Christian cultures, adultery is. I mean, there are some that accept it, but in most of them, it's
Well, and actually, the most common acceptance of that is in the post-Christian modern West. We don't even sneeze at fornication and adultery. Right? It's
because
people have
sex
open
has
marriages,
become the
right?
West's God.
Yeah. But God used this idolater to bring to Abraham's attention this sin, and I thought that was interesting. It's an important lesson for us. God, and we talked. Actually, I think you covered it yesterday, didn't you? We've talked about it before, but God uses our brothers and sisters to speak to us, right? And what's interesting here is that they don't have to be our brothers and sisters.
Be unbelievers.
They can be unbelievers to bring about His discipline and to bring His word to us. We need to be open to that. Now, bear in mind, we need to compare, as we would with the word from our brothers and sisters, we need to compare that to His word.
Yeah.
But He can use all sorts of people to point out our iniquities to us. We need to be open to that and willing to accept it.
And there are good and moral people that are not Christians.
Yes.
I mean, not in the sense that they could be saved.
Well, insofar as anyone is good.
Yeah. Because there is the Romans is pretty clear that there is a revelation to all man, all creation.
Yep.
I mean, that thing, the unbelievers know what's right and wrong. So we should know what's right and wrong.
C.S. Lewis talked about that as a proof of the existence of God, that we have a common conscience, a common sense of right and wrong. Couldn't have come out of nothing. If pure moral relativism is correct, right?
Then there shouldn't even
Then
be
we
a
wouldn't
sense of
we
right
wouldn't
and
have that common sense of right and wrong. Anyway, so gotta love Abraham here. In verse 11, Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister. the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, gonna go ahead and throw God into the list of people to blame. When God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, "This is the kindness you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother." I think this statement that there's no fear of God in this place sounds to me like the pot calling the kettle black. Abimelech showed more fear of God than Abraham did at this particular time, and that Pharaoh did years before that. And furthermore, the fear of God does not necessarily preclude bad behavior. And the story that sprang to my mind was this despicable, ugly story in Judges 19. I'm telling you, Judges makes the scariest Stephen King novel look like a walk in the park.
Well, what about David?
Oh yeah. But if you read that story in Judges 19, there was this Levite who had gone on a journey to go and fetch his concubine, and he went up to Bethlehem to retrieve her, and he was making his way back, and he got to Gibeah in the land, the territory of Benjamin, and the men of that town is very similar to what Lot's interaction with the two angels and the men of the town before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. They gave this guy that was that this Levite was staying with that night. These guys from the town wanted the Levite to come out so they could, quotes, know him, right? And instead they threw the concubine to him, and they raped her and beat her, and she ended up dying from it. And it actually caused a civil war in Israel. All the men of Benjamin were killed. Except
the ones that were on the rock. That they had to go steal wives for.
Yep, that's right. So at least Abraham didn't bother to make the case that he'd done all this for Sarah's sake, right? Like he did when they lied to Pharaoh. At least he owned up to doing it to save his own skin. Now, this idea that Sarah was actually his sister, if you go back and look at Genesis 11, the genealogy there of Abram's father, Terah, doesn't list his wives. Most of the genealogies don't. And we read that Abram took a wife, Sarai, but we don't read anything about her family history. So it may very well be that Terah, Abram's father, had another wife who ended up being the mother to Sarah, or Sarai, and so it may very well be that Sarai was indeed Abram's half-sister. But even if all that was true, what do they ask you when you raise your arm in court? You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? So he told her that, he may have told him that she was his sister, and that may have been true, but he didn't say, and my wife, right? And
we can't just assume that Abraham was telling the
truth. He did have a history of crying wolf. And by the way, he didn't pass this lesson on to his son Isaac either, as we'll read later. With another guy named Abimelech, by the way. But if we reflect on this a little bit, and Abraham's, dancing around the truth here, we can see a little bit of ourselves in him. he said there's no fear of the Lord here. Aren't we a little bit apprehensive about people that are outside of our circle? Don't we kind of watch them carefully until we find something out about them? We at least have a propensity. We may not actually be willing to follow through on it, but we have a propensity for bending the rules if it means the preservation of our own lives, right? So, kind of see that in Abraham and ourselves. But most of all, we are capable of the absolute wildest rationalizations to convince ourselves that we are right, even when we're wrong. As I said, perhaps Abraham, having been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, was attempting to convince himself that lying to Abimelech was justifiable. Right? We're willing to. There's a movie called The Big Chill, and one of the things that what's his name, Jeff Goldblum says in that movie, he says, "I can't get through the day without one or two juicy rationalizations." So we can see ourselves in Abraham. So in verse 14, it says, "Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants, and gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'Behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you.' To Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver.'" I could just hear him saying it that way. "I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It's a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated." Now, this reminded me of what Paul said in Romans. In Romans 12:17, it says, "Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head." And that, by the way, is a quote from Proverbs 25. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." This benevolence that Abimelech gave to Abraham and Sarah was for the benefit of his people. Right? The three of them knew what had gone on, right? The three of them were keeping it to themselves. Abimelech was showing his people that, yeah, Abraham, good guy. Sarah, great lady. Even though they had done him wrong.
Yeah, probably had something to do with it. Was God saying, "I'm going to destroy you"?
True.
Yeah, he got that message good. And he said, "I'm going to make sure
I'm
But-
going to do
I don't miss
everything
anything
possible to get out of this.
But God didn't tell him he had to give him 1,000 pieces of
he-
silver.
No, but he was making
He
sure.
impressed
Yeah.
upon it pretty good, though.
Yeah, but I love that. You can almost see him winking. You know, "I've given 1,000 pieces of silver to your brother," right? Anyway, finishing up here in 17 says, "Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife."
How long were they there?
Must have been a while, or he was sojourning now and again there out of Kadesh.
I mean, just
What struck
how
me
long
about
would they
this
have to be there for them to realize that
that
all
they
the
couldn't
wounds had been-
couldn't get pregnant. True, it's a good question. Something important for us to recognize this: God didn't answer Abraham's prayer and bless Abimelech because of Abraham's righteous behavior. Obviously, right? He answered the prayer just the way he answers our prayers, in his own way, in his own time, for his own purposes, for his own glorification. not because we're deserving, but despite the fact that we're not.
Thank goodness.
Yep. So next time, finally, remember when was the first time? Back in Genesis 16. So finally, 5 chapters later, we'll get to the birth of Isaac, and Isaac himself was a chip off of the old block. So anybody have any other comments about that?
By the way, the 2 other men that are mentioned in Jude were Balaam and Korah.
Okay.
And it wasn't that they were disputing over something. They were examples of rebellion.
There's somewhere else, though. It must not be in Jude.
Yeah, I skimmed all through Jude. That was the only other 2 names.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it takes a while to go through Jude.
I did the whole chapter.
It's what, 15 verses?
Did you blink?
We kind of wonder where, because the books are put in not
Somewhere
completely,
it's like
but
Jamrus
but
and
yeah.
something. Yeah.
You look
I
at
can't remember where it is. It might have been
the nature.
First Peter
If
or
we're chastened ourselves by the Lord, how do we take it? Here's this unbeliever who was challenged by the Lord, and hey, what you doing? You're going to die if you do this. But look at the effect it had on the man's life.
yeah.
Letting them go, and I'm going to give them all kinds of blessings as they go. Man. I'm not going to take it. We don't do that. We just take the challenge, the chastening, and we go along.
Yep.
We don't do anything about it sometimes.
Yep.
And we're not inclined to. He
Well,
was inclined to,
Here again, I don't, and this is just me talking. I don't believe Abimelech really intended to bless Abraham so much as to show his people
Right.
that Abraham was righteous and Sarah was blameless, even though everybody involved knew that they weren't. Then he says that in there, so everyone will know. You'll be vindicated, I think is the word that he said.
It just means that he didn't touch her.
Right.
I want to make sure everybody knew that.
Mm-hmm.